Thanks for being here. Today on the big program, lots to get to, lots to talk about. Looks like I was kind of hoping for another episode of 24, the ticking bomb down to the last second. Friday, government shutdown. I was kind of hoping for, all of that to happen. It's been kind of the MO, right? It's been the MO. It's been what we've been accustomed to. Every time you got to take it right down to the last second. And look, they did their best. Give them credit. They did their best to try and get it right down to the very last second. Because even if they do pass the massive $1.3 trillion spending plan, even if they do pass it in the House today, it's got to go to the Senate. Maybe tomorrow, maybe we get to it. Maybe it's done Friday. Maybe a day continuing resolution. Maybe. And I got to be honest. This isn't how you would operate a hot dog stand. I mean, this isn't how you would operate a hot dog cart on a street corner. It blows my mind that these people can't. It's coming. You know the deadline is there. You know the date is coming around. You know it. And yet, no. They've actually got it, something that they're going to put on, evidently going to put on Trump's desk. He's not thrilled with it. He's probably going to sign it, they say. But grudgingly is the word I keep seeing being used. He wants his wall. Pure and simple, wants the wall. Evidently, there's only, I guess, $1.6 billion in there for border security, not the $25 billion he wanted for the big, beautiful wall. But, in his defense, there isn't the $900 million that Democrats and Chuck Schumer wanted for the tunnel in New York City either. And I kind of had a solution. Maybe we just put up a giant wall on the border of New Jersey. People could tunnel right underneath it. We would have tunnels made already. What do you think of that? Since a couple of solutions to a couple of problems. It's just, I got to tell you, again, this is not how you run the most powerful superpower in history. This isn't how you do it. This is how you run it in the ground. But this is not how you operate this. Just kind of saying. Now, what they're also saying is, for those of us who fear that tons of bad things could happen before the end of the year, evidently this is it. This is the last major piece of legislation that they think that will get done this year before the midterm elections, which I got to be honest, kind of a small sigh of relief because they've only boogered the next generation up. I was fearful that it'd be maybe 3 or 4 generations before we could fix the damage they've already done. Now they say this tentative agreement is going to increase the national debt, and I keep going back to, we just gave $1.5 trillion away. Did we really need, honestly, truthfully, did we really need to increase the debt any further? Now understand how this. And I guess it goes back to, I actually paid attention in economics class. It was rare that I paid attention in class, but this was one of my, I think I was on that day. I seem to remember this conversation really well. That in times of economic turmoil, that in times of trouble, you run a deficit to help prop up the bottom of the economy. You help get, the words were prime the pump. I know Trump wanted to take credit for that back during the election, but someone had muttered that before, a guy named John Maynard Keynes, way back in the 40s. The idea is you prime the pump, or actually 30s. You put a little money into the economy, you get it going, you get it started. Maybe you prime it a little bit more, like I was saying we should have done in 2009, a little bit more than the stimulus. But then when things are getting better, when the pump is actually moving, you don't keep feeding it. You don't keep putting gas into it. It'll stall. Not a good idea. So what you do is you take the excess that you're producing during the good times and you pay off the debt from the bad times. And maybe even just a little bit of savings for the next bad time. Because the next bad time is coming. It's always coming. We have this roller coaster. The idea is when times are good, you save. When times are bad, you deficit spend. How hard is this? Problem is, we've got Republican politicians who love to play on the fact that we're an amnesiac society, and we forget that, times were tough once, and that it's heyday now, everything's wonderful. And then they love to, to be Santa Claus for the day and hand out huge checks to their wealthy donors. Now, again, you and I don't get very much. The working people don't get very much in this equation, other than more pain when the downs happen. But they always seem to want to give those surpluses away when they should be going to paying down some of our problems. Now, understand, there are some of the Freedom Caucus people who claim to understand this, but I argue that they're just contrarians anyway, and they'll argue against anything the government does at all. So there's really not a lot I expect from them. But the idea of a massive increase in our deficit and ultimately our debt when times are so great is a bad idea. While simultaneously wanting to deregulate the banks even further and giving massive tax cuts to the very wealthy to hoard and maybe ship more jobs overseas and do stock buybacks and all that other stuff. Bad ideas. But here we are. There are some things in there that, okay, we're going to get some stuff done. I guess the farm glitch has been fixed, which, again, this is what happens when you hastily ram through your tax bill. And for those who don't know what the grain glitch was, evidently the tax rates for grain growers who sell to co-ops was a lot lower. But it was at the expense of people who don't sell to co-ops. And there's part of me goes, I'm okay with that. The idea that you run things as a cooperative, for the community, for the common good, I'm right there. If you're selling it, who knows where. Maybe chuck in a penny or two extra. Just kind of a thought. Now, I guess there is a whole bunch of other stuff that goes into this as well. That you can't just do the budget. We just can't pay our bills. Evidently, there's a very narrow gun safety measure in there. Very, very, trust me, very narrow. Also, nothing on DACA and nothing on defunding sanctuary cities. Those seem to be the big highlights. Outside of, I guess there's going to be more money for the FBI to do cybersecurity to combat the Russian attacks, which didn't happen, by the way. Remember, the Russian attacks didn't happen, but we're going to put more money into cybersecurity for if they ever do it again. You can't make this stuff up. And this is my problem. This is always my frustration. And please, the next time you vote, ask yourself, is the person that I'm voting for someone who actually believes that what they're doing is beneficial to society? Now, I know there are a lot of Republicans out there who goes, I just want people who are going to drag it in the bathtub and strangle and drown it. I know there are those people out there. You should probably not be voting. You're the one screwing the system up. We could have a very functional government that could work for the common good of all of us, but not. And by the way, almost forgot, Obamacare is going to get a shot in the backside, and not in a good way. Evidently, they couldn't come to an agreement on stabilizing the individual marketplaces. So people who get their health care from Obamacare, guess what? You're probably going to get screwed. So just so you put that out there, you get that on the calendar so you can go, yeah, I remember when Rick said that. I knew it was coming. I probably should have prepared for it. But yeah, they couldn't let that go. Couldn't let that alone. And it's amazing to me. And again, this is the party of family values. The people telling me how much they love the children, and how much they care about all this rhetoric, actions, budgets, spending, priorities. They seem to be on the wrong side of all of them. Amazing to me, but not surprising. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Lots and lots to get to tonight. Interesting something coming out of the Supreme Court. I think you're going to find interesting. Maybe we can start getting rid of gerrymandering, maybe actually reclaiming the process of districting, making sure that we actually choose the people that represent us instead of them choosing us. Kind of a thought, kind of not a bad idea. Also, this seems to be the year of the woman, especially the millennial woman. We'll get some thoughts on that. Also, education, billionaire Betsy, and the craziness that goes on there and what workers and teachers across the country are doing to fight back. Lots to get to. Your thoughts, 1-888-520-RICK. All that and more. Quick break, right back. Stick around. Listen to The Rick Smith Show.
90% of the wealth, 10% of the people. 90% of the wealth. Where do you fit in? Take a look at yourself. 10% of the people. 90% of the wealth.
Where smart policy and sound investment matters. The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1947. That was the day President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9835. It is commonly referred to as the Loyalty Order. It required the screening of millions of federal civil servants and applicants. 9835 is considered one of the key preconditions for the rise of the McCarthyite Red Scare. It established a loyalty review board, a master index of those investigated, and definitions determining alleged disloyalty. Disloyalty could mean sedition, espionage, or advocating revolution. It could also mean membership or sympathetic association with movements considered totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive. Soon, the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations was published. It amounted to a blacklist. In their book, The 50s, Douglas Miller and Marion Nowak comment, between the launching of his security program in March of 1947 and December of 1952, some 6.6 million persons were investigated. Not a single case of espionage was uncovered, though about 500 persons were dismissed in dubious cases of questionable loyalty. All of this was conducted with secret evidence, secret and often paid informants, and neither judge nor jury. Despite the failure to find subversion, the broad scope of the official Red Hunt gave popular credence to the notion that government was riddled with spies. President Dwight Eisenhower would revoke 9835 with his Executive Order 10450, but this order dismantled the loyalty boards by transferring power to federal agencies. It also expanded investigations to include those engaged in immoral or disgraceful behavior. This included what is considered sexual deviance and led to the witch hunting and discrimination against gays and lesbians in civil service.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
Yes, good old Mike Turzai, Speaker of the Pennsylvania House. Voter ID, done. Not so much. And a good thing, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court pushed back on that. Also, good news this week. The U.S. Supreme Court did not take the Republicans' challenge of the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court's decision on the congressional maps. Gerrymandering in Pennsylvania, done. Not so much. And the good thing is it seems, and maybe I'm just being overly optimistic. Maybe I'm just being a little bit hopeful in that it seems like maybe the Supreme Court is going to do something on the gerrymandering front. Maybe we'll actually get to pick our elected leaders instead of the other way around. And the reason I have a little bit of optimism, and trust me, not a lot, but a little bit, is it appears from what I'm hearing that the U.S. Supreme Court is taking another gerrymandering case, this one from Maryland. And here to come talk a little bit about it, explain what it is and why maybe I have this optimism, is Dan Vicuna. He's a national redistricting manager for the folks over at Common Cause. Dan, thanks for taking time for us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So am I getting this right? Do I have some reason to be optimistic that maybe we may actually get the vote for our elected officials instead of them choosing us?
I do think you should have some optimism. I'll tell you why. This case, Benesek v. Lamone, the Supreme Court is going to hear next week, a week from today, actually. is related to a pretty egregious gerrymander done, in fact, in this case by Democrats to eliminate a Republican incumbent in Congress. And this case, it was sort of an interesting stage in the proceedings. It hadn't gone to trial yet. It sort of suggested, that in most normal circumstances, that the court would hear this case and, maybe later on, after it had already decided a case it already heard earlier on in the session, which was Gill v. Whitford, which was a challenge to a Republican gerrymander out of Wisconsin. And so the fact that the Supreme Court took this suggests that they may be looking for a way to do something about the problem of manipulating legislative lines, while not looking partisan. The Chief Justice in oral arguments in the Gill v. Whitford case expressed some concern that, if we rule in favor of the plaintiffs in this case, it look like the Supreme Court is just supporting Democratic candidates. So that they plucked this case sort of out of the early stages in Maryland, suggests that they may be willing to act, and something that the court has sort of long been reluctant to intervene in. Although over the course of many cases, it's stated that partisan gerrymandering, is sort of a problem in terms of democratic principles. They haven't acted, they haven't turned down a map or set standards yet, so we're hoping this might be the venue.
Is it possible that they can go, see, look, you both do it, it just is what it is, and they just let both of them go then? Is there any possibility of that?
We live in strange political times, so you never know. But I think, some of Justice Kennedy, as is often the case, is the swing justice in this situation. And there have been decisions, where he has really indicated that partisan gerrymandering is thoroughly distasteful, and that it probably violates the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. It's really an assault on the free expression, the association rights of people who choose to vote for a certain party or support a certain party. And he voted in the majority, a 5-4 majority, in a case out of Arizona, which challenged the right of voters to create independent citizen commissions, to really take that power away from self-interested politicians. He was with the majority that said the public has the right to do this. Partisan gerrymandering is a problem, and if voters want to do something about it, they should have the constitutional right to do so. So, I think there's a lot of hope there, especially because of the positive signs that Justice Kennedy has indicated.
So he could be that swing vote in another 5-4 decision.
That's how it's looking. But even some of the conservative justices in those same oral arguments, like Justice Alito, who we don't necessarily expect to vote our way, again sort of indicated that gerrymandering is really distasteful. It's undemocratic. Some of the conservative justices tend to throw up their hands and say, we can't really do anything about this. Fortunately, as you mentioned, in Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court there said otherwise. They struck down what was a clear manipulation of the districts in favor of Republicans. A trial court in our own case, Common Cause v. Rucho, earlier this year, struck down that state's congressional map as unconstitutional partisan gerrymander, and which is the first ever ruling in congressional districts on that, and we expect that to go to the Supreme Court later this year. So I think courts are realizing that today's manipulation of lines is more sophisticated, more effective, less democratic than ever before in the history of the Republic, and they seem more willing to get involved.
Yeah, I mean, just the computer software and the way it's been explained to me a number of times, where you could divide up houses. You can take the bedroom out of this house and put it into this district, and all of that. That's how complicated and sophisticated this whole game has become.
Yeah, it's incredibly different from the days of I was going to say 50, 60 years ago, but I mean it's even more sophisticated than the previous the 2000s. You're using big data, overlaying that with voter information, and really using the precision of sort of a surgeon's knife to divide up communities in a way that really doesn't just preordain the outcome of the next election, but really preordains the outcome of elections for the entire 10 years. And if that's not the very kind of definition of an undemocratic system, I don't know what is.
Now, you keep saying partisan gerrymandering. I've said for a while that I'm not opposed to the idea of gerrymandering, as long as we get to a position to where we're creating competitive districts. Because for me, the whole idea is that districts should be competitive so that you're fighting on ideas, not on who can rig the game to one side or the other. Is that something, something you could talk about as, because I know here in Pennsylvania they talk about compact and contiguous and, keeping things together. But there's part of me that goes, I wouldn't mind making Rorschach tests if it meant that we had competitive districts.
Well, there are competing interests here. I definitely understand the instinct to want to see greater competition. We do, however, want to make sure we're listening to communities to figure out, how we kind of keep communities together that, for purposes of effective representation, should be in the same districts. And and sometimes, that may not always mean you're not going to create a 50-50 district in every part of the state. But we found, for instance, in California, which has an independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, probably the most independent in the country. They did not, in fact, include competitiveness as an explicit criteria to draw districts. So what they did was they said, you can't draw districts to benefit one party or candidate. You can't pay attention to incumbent addresses, and then the people we're going to have on this commission have to be screened really tightly to ensure that they're not, party hacks, not, politicians, recent candidates. And even without that competitiveness mandate, just by focusing on listening to communities, getting 20,000 people, giving oral testimony and written testimony, they drew districts, and it was a revolution. The first election that came after that redistricting cycle, incumbents against incumbents, fighting it out, people that hadn't campaigned in decades, who had been able to rest on their laurels, really had to go out there and fight for it, and some of them lost, and it was you compare to the rest of the country, which has re-election rates like the Soviet Politburos. It was a huge sea change. So I think you can really focus on the needs of the communities and create that competitiveness you're looking for.
Now, let's say the Supreme Court does rule the way you hope they do. Would this create that environment, or would this create an environment where states could do this stuff?
Well, I think that if the Supreme Court does the right thing and either strikes down partisan gerrymandering entirely, or at least sets some outward limit on it, I think that will generate some momentum for reforms in the states, because the old rules in which politicians can choose their voters will no longer apply. Any attempt to really manipulate the districts for personal political advantage is going to court, and those plaintiffs have a good chance of success. So we're going to go around and continue to make the case that we should take this out of the hands of politicians, or make it at least a bipartisan process where if you must insist on having the politicians involved, at least set it up such that one party can't steamroll the other. So we definitely think a good decision in the Supreme Court is a first step, but we're definitely going to keep pushing for reform after that.
Yeah, but I look at it. Pennsylvania claims to have something of a divided system where you have both parties have representatives and they have to come to some kind of agreement. But it just always seems to be that in their hands, they take care of their own. They create really safe districts for their own on both sides, and I'm not pointing fingers at one person or the other. But they make really hyper safe districts for incumbents and especially leadership, and everybody else not so much.
Right. You have the problem of which these cases don't necessarily address, the sort of bipartisan gentleman's agreement that you're going to protect both parties' incumbents. That was something that was fairly prevalent in California pre-commission. And, so that's why I think, in the end, the drawing of districts is an incredibly important process. We do it every 10 years to ensure that districts have equal population. You want to make sure that the public has equal political power in the halls of government, and to make sure that it reflects demographic changes. So, it's important, something we got to do. But when politicians control it, or when you have a system, even like you mentioned, when it's, it's bipartisan, but those selectees who are on a commission, can sort of pick up the phone and just talk to the person that appointed them and say, so what do you want? What do you need me to do? It doesn't fix the problem. So to whatever extent we can empower the public to have a real voice in their own representation, to take that power away from self-interested electeds, that's something we're pushing for in among our state organizations around the country. So
what should we be doing? This case obviously generating a little bit of excitement, I think. What should people be doing?
I think contact your local Common Cause organization, your League of Women Voters. There are a ton of robust public education efforts with citizens, finding creative ways to to tell the story of gerrymandering's harm. In speaking of Maryland, where the case is based, they sort of understand that to a lot of people this is a bit of a wonky issue, kind of hard to wrap your head around its importance, and so they've tried to make it as interesting as possible with birthday parties for Elbridge Gerry, the kind of a namesake of the manipulation of districts, doing a bar crawl, where they had 4 different bars that were close to each other, but were all in 4 different congressional districts and had speakers at each site. I'd say finding ways to tell the story in a creative way by getting involved locally, shaming your local electeds, I think is really an effective way to go.
Yeah, that was a good start. I mean, and not having cartoon character districts where one cartoon character is kicking the other one in the behind. Maybe a good
Sounds
start.
like a good way to go. Yep.
Maybe a good start. Dan, I appreciate the time. I appreciate the input. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good stuff. If you want to check out their information, just commoncause.org is the website. We'll get a link at thericksmithshow.com. You can check out more on what's going on and maybe how to get involved. Where I'm at in Pennsylvania, Fair Districts PA is the group that focuses mostly on this, and I think they do a fantastic job. I'm going to take a quick break. Right back. Stick around. You listen to The Rick Smith Show. For working people. Time to talk.
Making the blue blood see red. The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1960. That was the day of the Sharpeville Massacre in South Africa. Black South Africans were required to carry identification documents. These passes limited who could live or work in designated white areas of the country. This restricted black workers from finding employment, especially in urban areas, if they did not have the required pass. Police would patrol the restricted areas looking for and arresting those without documentation. Black residents organized against this restrictive apartheid regime. At the township of Verning, a large crowd gathered, numbering in the thousands. Petrus Tom, a factory worker who had become an organizer for the Metal and Allied Workers Union, described the plans that led up to the demonstration. Inside his factories, workers would wear "Away with the Passes" stickers. They organized at bus stops, urging workers getting off the buses to burn their passes in defiance of the restrictive law. Petrus said it was the strongest campaign I'd ever seen. The organizers called for a demonstration outside the local police station. The plan was to turn themselves in for arrest for refusing to carry the pass. The police fired into the crowd of unarmed protesters, killing 69 people. 200 more were injured. Most of those shot by police were shot in the back as they were trying to flee the gunfire. Thousands of black South Africans were arrested in the days following the protest. Sharpeville became a watershed moment in the anti-apartheid struggle. In 1996, Nelson Mandela chose Sharpeville as the site to sign the country's new constitution. Today is now honored as Human Rights Day in South Africa. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
Standing tall against a multinational corporate agenda. The Rick Smith Show.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Interesting little bit today. It's only only a week later. It's only a week late, right? Today you had Rick Saccone, the Republican candidate for the 18th congressional district in Pennsylvania, finally conceding. He made the phone call to Democrat Connor Lamb, wishing him the best. Lamb tweeted out that they had a nice conversation, gracious, all that stuff. But it only took a little over a week to do it. What we all actually knew from the beginning. Anyway, the blue wave they keep saying is going to sweep away this electoral cycle. There are also those who are saying this is going to be the year of the woman and women. And look, and I've been saying for a long time, take over. Can't do any worse than we've done. which is why I've asked our good friend Helaine Olen to come talk with us. She's got a new piece over at the Washington Post on how millennial women may change our politics. Helaine, thanks for taking time for us.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
So, we've been hearing this frame that, the blue wave's going to come sweeping it away. Well, a big part of that is, women as well, because it appears women are a good portion of that blue wave.
Yes, I mean, I was fascinated by this. I should say there was a study that came out from the Pew Research Group earlier this week about voter identification as of now. And I was particularly fascinated by it because we've made so much of the the resistance, which is mostly women my age and older, right? Middle-aged, white women, basically, right? And in fact, where you notice the real surge and change in voter identification is not with the middle-aged baby boomers and Gen Xers. It's actually with the millennials. There have been slight shifts among the Gen Xers and baby boomers, but millennial women now identify as Democrats at about a 7 to 10 ratio, which is astonishing. It's a 15% increase since 2014. And it's mostly driven, by the way, by the identity of white women who roughly in 2014 split their party identity, or leaning towards one party, between Republican and Democrat, and are now more likely than not over 60% identifying as Democrat or leaning Democrat.
Well, could you make the argument that 2015 was kind of a watershed year for politics with women, because you had the grabber in chief coming onto the scene. You've had all of these allegations of harassment by the Marmalade Mussolini. I mean, there seems to be a driver there, and if I were a betting man, that's where I think I'd put my money.
There is a driver, but I need to point out that the extreme shift did not happen with women in other age groups. I mean, again, there was slight shifts. There's always been a gender gap. And the gender gap has opened up a little bit more. I should say that women, while men still favor the Republican Party by a slight amount, 48-44, women are now 56%, percent identifies Democrat or leaning Democrat, which is a slight increase. The real change has been in millennials. And what I think is going on is I think there's a couple of things, because at that point, you're really piecing survey details together. But I think Trump is a huge factor. I am not going to deny that I think the Trump campaign was a huge, huge factor. But I also think that you have to really realize that millennial women are really the first generation of women to grow up and think they deserve better. For the rest of us, it's always been kind of a learned thing. We didn't grow up in a world necessarily where we thought we were going to get better. I always tell people, my mother didn't even have the right to her own credit card until I was almost 10 years old. It was a different world. We kind of forget about it now. But I think for these women, it's kind of shocking to come into a world and, get out of school where they do so much better, by the way, than boys, right? You read about elementary school and it's the trouble with boys, and boys aren't learning, and, boys take more ADD medication than girls, and I could go on. Women go to college at greater rates than men, significantly so. Then they graduate and it all falls apart. In fact, one of the stats out there says that men with higher education, the more education you get, the greater the gender gap.
Really? Now that surprises me.
Yeah, and hey, it's, doctors have a much bigger one than, blue collar workers. I mean, it's just simply astonishing. It's like things you don't think about. And of course, women are, as we know, the Me Too movement has also been a huge radicalizer, particularly, again, for younger women. The canard is that there's generational warfare going on. That is not true. You look at it, most women agree they've been sexually harassed at some point. They agree that something needs to be done about it. Where you see divides open is younger women are more likely to think men who are accused should get tossed overboard, which probably isn't a surprise. And the other one is that they feel more strongly that they want to see more female politicians. Interestingly, you don't see that as much with Gen Xers and Boomers. Again, you see it in silence. You see it to some extent, but you don't see it as much.
That's interesting because, it's, and I'm probably one of the few people who say this, but I think, it was the gender issue here in Pennsylvania where I'm at that cost Hillary the state, as well as Katie McGinty, the the Senate run, because there were 3 white men that ran statewide offices. They all won by 5 points. The
right.
2 women
and I should say that when you look at the millennial figures, you'll find that white male millennials support the Republican Party more than they used to. It's the complete opposite, right? The difference is it's a small move, whereas with the women, white millennial women, it's been a ginormous move.
Interesting, because this election we're seeing a lot more. I think a lot more women are running in this election than ever before. So are we optimistic that there will be more representation? Or do you see as some fear that maybe that, like here in Pennsylvania, you have that segment of the old guard, flipping the other side?
I think you're going to see it go a little bit both ways, but my guess is based especially off of what we saw in Texas a few weeks ago, we are definitely going to see more representation. It's not just, again, millennial women, it's women of a bunch of different generations. But the other thing is millennials younger voters tend to not vote as much. These millennial women are, according to other survey data research released in the past few weeks, the women who are leading Democrat are saying they're more likely to vote in November. I'll believe it, when it really happens, because we know that good intentions are good intentions. But, more of them are saying that than the women who are say they lean Republican or say they are completely independent. So that is potentially a good sign, given how much they lean towards the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and then that blue wave does happen. My fear then happens is you get this huge wave in 2018 and everyone stays home for 2020.
I don't know. I mean, what was really fascinating to me in this is one of the largest gender gaps seen in the data. And if this holds, it really has enormous potential going forward. Because as we know, there is a gender gap. Women do tend to favor the Democratic Party, but it's not by huge margins. And it also tends to be concentrated, with boomers, with Gen Xers, not so much elderly women. As this pushes up the sort of age food chain, so to speak, this really has enormous potential to rejigger our politics, should it last? And that's the big question, of course. Does it last?
Yeah. And the other question that I have is, once women take over, do they take on all of the worst qualities that men have taken on? Or do we get progressive policies? Do we end up with, paid family leave? Do we end up with a national health care? Do we end up pursuing different political paths instead of what we've been on?
Well, what we know is that women tend to support the social safety net at much higher rates than men do. We know this. This is in the data repeatedly over and over and over again. And there's probably very little reason to think that will change very much. The question, of course, is, will the female politicians do it? And that I can't answer. I mean, we all know power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. On the other hand, Democratic women have been fairly strong in trying to push for, for changes and protections. And we'll see if that continues.
Now, this is really a huge shift. I mean, just in a very short period of time. From the beginning of, the beginning of the Trump presidency to now, this kind of, the conversation really has shifted, because it was just a couple of years ago, women weren't being this militant. And I kept saying, at some point they're going to say enough's enough. And I think we're there.
Yeah. And I don't think anybody ever would have predicted Harvey Weinstein was going to be the catalyst. That's for sure.
And again, you're somebody who's a total pig. But here's the thing. Everybody knew that, though. I mean, this is one of those things that when I grew up, everyone knew about the casting couch. Everyone knew that the horrible things that were going on, and people just turned and kept going.
Well, that's what I mean about this generation, right? I mean, you and I grew up thinking certain things, and they not so much. And that's like a really good thing. I mean, I think I've written about this as well with the kids in Parkland, where there's been all this talk, as you know, that parents were bringing their children up to, they were cuddling them and they were telling them they could expect anything and they'd do anything for them. And apparently, as it turns out, if you raise entitled kids, they feel entitled to be treated well. Yeah. And that's not always a bad thing.
Who would have thunk it?
Right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I have these conversations with my wife. We talk about, how we're raising our children and what their expectations are. And, we don't want them to be, have too much self-esteem, but we want them to have some and demand better. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And it seems like they are. And it's really been kind of an astonishing thing to watch, because I don't think a lot of people would have predicted, say, what happened in Parkland. I mean, I think everybody was sort of waiting for a mass shooting to spark some massive backlash. What I don't think anybody expected was that it would be teenagers who did it.
Yeah, I got to be honest. There's part of me that thinks they're the only ones who could do it, simply because everybody else has got their own entrenched interests.
I agree, but that almost feels like we're all saying that in retrospect now. I mean, I don't remember anybody. I mean, maybe I missed something. I'm not going to claim to be the great expert on this ever, but I don't remember anybody ever saying a movement will be led by teenagers at a high school where this happened. I mean, it just didn't occur to anybody. I don't think.
I don't know that that's necessarily true. I mean, isn't that our history, though? I mean, we did a civil rights tour back in 2015, and place after place where we went, it was the high school students. It was the students who led all of that stuff. And I still remember the woman, telling me that she jumped out of her math class window to get to the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham to participate in the march that happened there, where Bull Connor sigged the dogs on them. It was the younger generation who really were the drivers in that.
Yeah, but they were also the foot soldiers. There was a lot of organization that went on for years before the civil rights movement took off. As given what it was up against, it's hard to believe anything else could have gone that way, right? And of course, young people are always the drivers who are out in front. I think the difference is this has just seemed to be initiated by the students almost out of nowhere. I mean, they social media and they started it, and then they received adult help. So it kind of went in a different order.
Yeah, I mean, they are the generation of social media. There's no question about that.
No, absolutely. I mean, I joke about it. When I use a mouse, you see my hands sort of being jerky, and when my kids do it, it's this very fluid movement. It's like I'm speaking English as a second language.
Yeah, I mean, and to take on these kids, they've got it. I mean, immediately they were all on the same page on Twitter and doing the Facebook stuff, and it was all there. And they've put together what I think is a really important movement across the entire country in a very short period of time.
In an amazingly short period of time. I mean, they were just phenomenal. I mean, these kids were tweeting while they were like literally locked in closets. I mean, hiding from the gunmen. I mean, it was actually kind of a remarkable amount of presence. I'm still sort of in awe of it, actually.
Absolutely, I'm with you.
But I think, you're seeing a lot of organization out there right now, right? Resistance to Trump, these middle-aged women are also coming kind of out of, I don't want to say they're coming out of nowhere, but what it seems like is that a lot of them were not particularly politically engaged. I mean, a lot of them were probably involved in things like the PTA and some local politics, but their town council or whatever, but they were certainly not involved as a level of showing up at local committee meetings and, manning phones and, collecting signatures on petitions and all the rest. And now they are. And that's fantastic. I mean, that's a good thing.
It's going to be a real interesting next couple of months to watch this develop even further and to see what happens in November. I absolutely agree. And I think that's going to answer a lot of questions, because there are some, I've had conversations with people who say, maybe this just fans out in a couple of months and things will go back to normal. I don't know that I'm quite there, but we'll see what happens in the election. Yeah, I can't imagine this level of intensity can last, but I think we're seeing real substantive changes at this point. I don't think people are just going to sort of quit and go away either. I think people have kind of realized that the political system in a lot of ways has gotten away from most of us, that we're, if not powerless, we don't have as much say as maybe we thought we did. Right. And that's not just a problem of Trump. That's a problem of a lot of different things. That's a problem of Citizens United and the power of money in politics. That's the power of the consultant lobbyist class in Washington, which impacts both parties.
It's a problem of discouraging voting, which, includes everything from the South, where, it's rigged in parts of the South where they discourage, there are regulations, voting rights problems with African Americans, to states like New York, where, the registration deadlines are impossible for some people. I mean, and I think there's just been this kind of outcry over all of it. And it seemed to start with Trump and just keep going, and is sort of filtered out into all sorts of things. It's really quite incredible.
Yeah, I had someone say, this is kind of like the era of the ERA era, that you had, a lot of women who were, doing a lot of things because they demanded change. And, it in a very short period of time, it itself did kind of fan out as people went back to life.
Well, also, the ERA failed. I mean, you have to remember that. I mean, there was a long struggle for it, and it ultimately failed, in part due to Phyllis Schlafly. And, I think there was a lot of, it was years of struggle. I mean, we forget things, right? But the late 60s and most of the 70s were sort of constant upheaval that way. And it really sort of dissipated after Reagan got elected. And we sort of, shifted into what, was a 30-plus year period of sort of what I like to refer to as turbo capitalism, where everything was about the markets. And it seems that we're shifting back in some ways towards a more inclusive version of what we want to be as a society. And how that will shake out, I wouldn't even pretend to predict.
That's why it's going to be interesting to pay attention and find out what happens. Helaine, I appreciate the time. I appreciate the article. Good stuff.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks so much. Always great to talk to our good friend, Helaine Olen. Again, you can check out her work. We'll get a link at thericksmithshow.com. Let's take a quick break. Right back after this. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
Creeping through the door. It's desperate times, so desperate measures we explore. Marching on the Capitol to lobby leaders for involvement. 3,000 people screaming out, "Where's our government?" Lawsuits and arraignments, members under company surveillance. Public divided, either they love us or they hate us. Profit billions off our back, and it's still not enough. They should have took into account that we never give up. We'll be here one day longer. One day longer. The people's voice is stronger. We work hard for our money, we work hard for respect. Keep fighting for these rights for generations, it's next. One day longer. One day longer. The people's
Your
voice is
working class
stronger.
radio experience, where hard work, common sense, and rational thought are a reality. The Rick Smith Show.
One that's done all the things you set out to do. Stand. There's a cross for you to bear. Things to go through if you're going anywhere.
Well, I got to tell you, Helaine's got an interesting point. I mean, the reality is this is the first generation of young women who were told, hey, you can do anything. You can do anything men can do. And I've raised my daughters to think the exact same way. And they believed it. And as she pointed out, if you're raising a generation of entitled kids, they're going to feel that they're entitled. And while, some would say it's a bad thing, on this front, they're entitled to being treated equally. It's going to be interesting to see what happens come November. And look, as I've been saying, the idea is that it just doesn't stop with the sexual harassment stuff. It continues on into rebuilding a working class movement of people who don't just say, I want to be treated with dignity and respect in my person, but I also want to make a decent living. That should be part of all this. And I've said from the beginning, you want to stop the harassment, organize and demand that it stop. Big part of it. My thoughts. Anyway, here's one of those interesting little tidbits. You've got the Trumpster running around saying we need to be kicking all these people out of the country because they're all illegals. Turns out the National Golf Club there in Westchester County, there in New Jersey, evidently they're seeking permission to hire 14 foreign guest workers under the under the H-2 visa program, which is supposed to be only if you can't find anyone here. Now they're looking for waiters and waitresses. They're looking for servers to serve their banquets and stuff. Now I find it incredibly difficult to believe that there's no one here willing to do those jobs. They say the starting pay for cooks is $14.36 an hour. For servers, pay $15.20 an hour. Evidently, both jobs are available. You can get overtime with them. Now, $14 and $15 an hour in New York, New Jersey, not high wage, but not horrible, I guess, either. But here's the other part of this, and this is where I come back to this idea that, the free market. And this is, again, the free market is saying that if no one's applying for this, the free market is saying the wages are too low. Again, back to that whole economic argument. And the invisible hand. Understand, wages have not gone up all that much in the last 30 years. People are still struggling to make ends meet. People are still on the treadmill falling behind. And it's jobs like these where you go, with $15 an hour to get a server to come to your country club, that's probably not on the bus line. If that's not high enough, maybe you should raise it to 16. Oh, I know. Can't possibly do that because that's how the invisible hand works. It would be so much easier to go, you know what? Let's get someone from El Salvador or somewhere from Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or some other place so that we artificially hold down the wages. I mean, that's the thing that gets me. At some point, don't we have to also say that this too? But I just found it ironic that that Trump's golf club going to be seeking guest workers to come in and serve him his meal. Oh boy! I remember the other day we were talking about Ralph Peters, the former Fox News contributor, who handed in his resignation, saying that Fox was nothing but a propaganda machine. Evidently, this is one of these things over at Fox that has really taken hold. And it's almost become a fantasy of a number of workers there who want to do the same thing. In fact, evidently, according to reports, one employee told CNN that they were actually jealous of the guy and the way he cut ties. And that, this worker and others fantasized about doing something exactly the same way. And I've been saying this for years because, I used to go to these talkers conventions where they would have, all of these right-wing hacks. And when you would talk to them, off, like you're at the table where they got the muffins and the tea or whatever else they've got. And you're just talking about they're normal people. In fact, I doubted that half of them bought into the nonsense that they were spewing. And, there were a couple of them that stick out in my mind were actually decent human beings. But boy, when they were on, when it was their turn to out crazy the crowd, it was amazing to watch them work. And it was all shtick. It seemed like it was all a performance, and very little of it they took to heart. And at the end of it, it was like, hey, I didn't say anything, didn't do anything, just move right along. And you got to wonder how many of these people over at Fox News, outside of Hannity, I think Hannity is one of these people who's, he drank his own Kool-Aid, probably intravenously or rectally or whatever. So he's gone. And O'Reilly was, he was out there. He just wanted to be, hey, look at me. But some of the other people there, I mean, to watch them stretch to try and be provocative, and it's something that I'm not very good at. And I've always said I'm not good at being, this kind of, I'm going to say something just to catch someone's attention. That's not my shtick. What I say and what I talk about, I believe. And I think it's important. But I see this stuff, and it's not really surprising to me. Now, it's what the stories are now saying is that the Fox executives are kind of worrying because, they've built this little propaganda network. They've built this little machine. They've built this group that, the people who are watching, the old curmudgeons who are watching them and sucking up everything that they spew may have a mass exodus of people going, you know what? I can't do this anymore. especially as you look at them having to defend Trump over and over and over again. And, you know, I had this back and forth just the other day about Stormy Daniels. And we've talked about her a couple of times, not as often as probably most, but, you know, more than I really wanted to. And I said, I really don't care at all about Stormy Daniels. I don't care about the story whatsoever. I don't care who Donald Trump slept with. I don't care that he cheated on his wife. I don't care about any of that stuff. Out of my lane. That's her problem. What I do care about is the fact that the $130,000 payment, in my view, could be campaign finance violation, could be an FEC violation, and somebody should be going to jail. It was a payoff. It was a bribe. It was to shut her mouth before an election. That, I believe, is, or at least should be, illegal if it's not. That's where I care about it. Whether Donald Trump slept with her or not, whether it was unprotected or not, whether she's got a tiny little picture of his Cheeto, I don't care. I don't want to know. And I hope that they don't publish them. I hope there's none of that. It comes back to the FEC violation. And that's, again, we get so sucked up and so misled with the salacious stuff, with the headlines. Hey, look over here, while the real problems are over there. You know, it's like this Cambridge Analytica stuff. There's a lot here. And yeah, they're using hookers and blow, and they're bribing people. But at the end of it, man, they're collecting our information like never before. People all over the world know more about us than we know about ourselves. And I'm telling you, scary, scary times. And I keep coming back to the reality of the situation. We've got to keep our eye on the prize. We've got to keep always testing and always questioning what's being put in front of us. Always fighting back. Because it's not going to get any easier. From here on out, not any easier. Trust me. Especially when you've got a handful of corporations who control the vast majority of everything we see, hear, and read. Just is what it is. Love to hear your thoughts. You can share them with me, Rick at thericksmithshow.com. Quick break. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show.
Controversial, thought-provoking, opinionated. Rick Smith. The most important issues of the day. This is the Rick Smith Show. The most important issues of the day. This is the Rick Smith Show.
So I'm kind of getting a kick out of this Cambridge Analytica story. You go back to, it was 2016. You had Jared running around saying, you know, we found that Facebook and digital targeting were the most effective ways to reach the audiences. After the primary, we started ramping up. We brought in Cambridge Analytica. And then, 2017, you got their CEO, Alexander Nix, running around saying, we did all the research, all the data, all the analytics, all the targeting. We ran all the digital campaign, the television campaign, and our data informed all the strategy. So they're saying, we did it all. It was all us. And now there was a Politico article, just I guess it was yesterday, that someone who is an unnamed Trump campaign source said, well, we did it all. They didn't really do anything. The data analytics firm only provided limited staffing during the 2016 campaign, and the Trump campaign did not use the firm's data. So I'm guessing this is the next in the obsession for this administration. I'm expecting the tweets, lots of them. We did it all. In fact, they had Barron in the basement on the computer. And I'm not picking on Barron. He'd be a smart kid if he got away with it. Anyway, let's find out what's going on in Washington, D.C. and around the world. Justin Duckham Talk Media News. Justin, what's going on?
Hey, great to be here. It is cold and snowy, and most of the government has shut down. So one of those days.
Yeah, and no golfing today, huh?
No golfing today. No, it was a welcome reprieve.
So the big thing there is, I guess, like OJ in the glove. You know, if it doesn't fit, you must have quit. No, congratulate, huh?
Yeah, exactly. This was a message that was given to the president on his briefing notes, according to the Washington Post, and put forward very specifically. Written in bold letters and all capitals on the top of it, telling him not to congratulate Putin for his electoral win in what was pretty much a sham election, and something that the president ultimately decided to just flatly ignore. Not just that, he also shared that detail with us in the Oval Office yesterday when we were there, saying that he called Putin to congratulate him and to also meet up sometime in the future to discuss some of the things that are still on the table, be it North Korea, be it Syria, other regions of interest. And, again, just putting on a very rosy perspective of the relationship that Trump is apparently trying to cultivate between the U.S. and Russia, despite the fact that we saw an election wherein the top opposition leader was conveniently left off the ballot.
Conveniently.
Yeah.
And arguably he was convicted of trumped up felony charges as well, which is part of the reason why he wasn't allowed on the ballot, right?
Exactly. This is something that he was pulled off for, and no matter how you slice it, this is just not a fair election. There's other concerns about fraud. There's other just sort of understanding that Putin is somebody who has played fast and loose with the rules in his country and is not interested in ceding power anytime soon.
No, he's not going anywhere. But again, I look at it as Trump going, this is someone I'd like to aspire to be, or if not that, just whatever, like a 2-year-old. If anyone who's ever had a 2-year-old knows, if you tell them no, the first thing they do is you turn your back, bang, they're right doing it. And you tell them, the more you tell them no, the more they want to do it. So it was my view, maybe they should have written in big capital letters, be sure to congratulate him, or Obama didn't, or Obama congratulated him. That'd be even better yet.
I mean, there's a certain level of Trump psychology that, just seems to be common sense that a lot of his advisors haven't quite gotten around to yet. I guess it was sort of an idea that maybe you can't really use subtlety and hence using the bold capital letters and whatnot. But, in this case, it's something that's not really about not understanding, I guess. It's more about
defiance.
Yeah, this huge level of just trying to be as defiant as you possibly can and pave your own path, even if it puts us in a situation where the U.S. is, congratulating people who just really don't deserve it.
Yeah, I mean, it's someone who rigged the election and may have had people killed in the UK. And what could go wrong there with us congratulating him for
Which
that?
is, of course, something he did not bring up in the call yesterday. He did
of course not.
The nerve agent attack. He did not discuss Russian meddling and left those topics off the table, despite the fact that, those are the primary pressing issues with Russia right now. So just an abdication of the big picture.
Yeah, it's amazing stuff. But again, not surprising. Nothing to see here. Move along. Let's move along. Evidently, Mississippi is going to get their first female member of Congress.
Yeah, exactly. This is some big news that came out today. Mississippi has never, in fact, had a woman representing the state in either chamber. And today we now have the agriculture commissioner appointed by the governor to take that position. Now, this is interesting in the sense that this is only going to be for a number of months. There's going to be a special election that's going to be held in November, wherein voters are going to go on and, cast a final ballot in this. And already this is being a harshly contested race. There is one member of the state Senate who's running to the right of pretty much anybody he can, trying to say that this is a middle of the road moderate decision from the governor, and therefore we need to have, true conservatives represented, apparently urging Trump in an open letter not to endorse the governor's choice and just moving on there. So, it's I guess a cultural victory in a sense, but one that could really be short-lived and one in which, the voters in the state are going to have a chance to essentially vote down a woman again. And in this instance, we have seen some polling that shows that the Tea Party challenger. In this instance, Chris McDaniel is pulling ahead.
Interesting. Now, has she come out and said, as some candidates have said, or some people who fill these spots, I'm only going to fill out the term, I'm not going to run for anything. Has she come out and said that, or is she?
Yes, well, she is going to be running in the special election,
Okay.
so it's going to be a highly contested race where we're going to see we're going to see a Republican going after a Republican. Probably not to the point where we're going to see Democrats winning by any stretch of the imagination, since this is Mississippi. It's not the the left-wing cultural bastion like Pennsylvania 18,
or Alabama.
Or Alabama, yeah. No, this is different.
Yeah, there are no child molesters there yet. Maybe some Nazis, but no child molesters.
Not touching that with the 10-foot pole, Rick.
Don't even go there. But hey, Illinois may have their first Nazi in Congress too. I understand. The primary yesterday, a Nazi won.
Yeah, apparently this was an uncontested primary for the Republican Party, and just raises a question where, why didn't somebody else come in here and stop it? You see people like Jeff Flake, you see people like Bob Corker who are willing to step up and speak down to this kind of thing. So it's just kind of a shame that there wasn't anybody in the state who was willing to stand up and I guess take a party nomination away from a Nazi. That's sort of a glaring oversight on the Republican Party, and that state's fault.
Yeah, and and when I read that, I'm thinking, well, Illinois has got a long history of Nazis. My favorite movie, The Blues Brothers. There's a scene in there where Belushi goes, "I hate Illinois Nazis," and I agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things that just seems very 2018. David Duke is obviously somebody who's also aiming for a higher office as well. And it just kind of goes to show that if you don't necessarily get into local races, you run the risk of having disasters like this take place.
Now, is there any chance of this guy in Illinois actually winning?
I highly doubt it. I think it's sort of a foregone conclusion at this point that it's not going to be going towards a Nazi. But I never know. Never know, which is
never know. In Alabama, I have a friend who lives in Alabama who says, never thought Doug Jones was going to win, but he did. We'll see. Let's move on. Evidently, the FBI director's saying that the firing of McCabe was not political. Is that true?
Yeah. So there's going to be an interview that's airing, or that aired tonight, that has Christopher Wray, the FBI director, being interviewed by NBC, and he is asked point blank over the politics of Andrew McCabe's firing, and didn't quite answer the issue, but tried to put forward this very stern message that the Bureau is not impacted by politics, and that nothing untoward happened in this decision. And for the most part, there is sort of an official veneer that you could put over it. There was an IG report. There was a recommendation that came from the basically the Office of Personnel that said that he should be reprimanded. But nevertheless, this is a individual who Trump has targeted very specifically, targeted publicly, and then took a victory lap after he was fired. So, there's some serious questions over whether or not politics was actually devoid of this.
I don't know how you can't look at that scenario, especially as you pointed out, the victory lap and all of the targeting that's gone on for a while, and is this obsession with this guy's wife. I mean, it kind of makes me wonder if Trump, doesn't have a thing for her too. It just makes you wonder.
Yeah, I mean, and this decision the White House ultimately gave to Jeff Sessions, who is the same Jeff Sessions who Trump has been attacking for being weak for quite some time, trying to give some official guidance to the DOJ via, some vaguely worded tweets, and to try to say that this was not, a move to protect Sessions' job, just doesn't seem to pass the smell test.
No, I'm with you. But I got to think that there was something more than just leaving it on Jeffy's lap, though. I can't imagine that he came to that all on his own.
Well, I mean, Sarah Sanders took this question, said that it was Jeff Sessions' decision, but then went on to call McCabe a bad actor. Pretty harsh words from somebody who's just the, spokesperson for the president. So it's so your skepticism is pretty much warranted.
I can't wait till they fire her. Honestly, I mean, I'm waiting for that day because I've never had a visceral reaction to any of the other press secretaries of the past. I mean, I wasn't a huge fan of Dana Perino. Ari Fleischer, you could take him or leave him. You can go down the list of any of them, especially during the Bush years. Didn't necessarily dislike them on a visceral level. This woman I despise.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I hear pretty frequently. And, she is somebody who plays fast and loose with the rules. I sort of have a running total going on of when she says something that's immediately contradicted by the president the day after. And that's a pretty long list at this point. But, as somebody who has to sit in that briefing room on a pretty frequent basis, my main thought is, it's tough, but at least it's not Josh Earnest. I like him. I have nothing against him personally, but at a certain point, those started to turn into 3-hour-long college courses. So there's sort of a give and take, and that's speaking from a purely selfish perspective.
I hear you. I guess maybe she's at least entertaining in the constant lies that come out.
I'm just saying there's a reason why those briefings weren't televised every day.
Good point. Justin, I appreciate the time, man. Thanks so much.
Have a good one.
Our good friend Justin Duckham, Talk Media News. Quick break. Right back. Stick around.
Radio of, for, and by we the working people. The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1947. That was the day President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9835. It is commonly referred to as the Loyalty Order. It required the screening of millions of federal civil servants and applicants. 9835 is considered one of the key preconditions for the rise of the McCarthyite Red Scare. It established a loyalty review board, a master index of those investigated, and definitions determining alleged disloyalty. Disloyalty could mean sedition, espionage, or advocating revolution. It could also mean membership or sympathetic association with movements considered totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive. Soon, the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations was published. It amounted to a blacklist. In their book, The 50s, Douglas Miller and Marion Nowak comment, between the launching of his security program in March of 1947 and December of 1952, some 6.6 million persons were investigated. Not a single case of espionage was uncovered, though about 500 persons were dismissed in dubious cases of questionable loyalty. All of this was conducted with secret evidence, secret and often paid informants, and neither judge nor jury. Despite the failure to find subversion, the broad scope of the official Red Hunt gave popular credence to the notion that government was riddled with spies. President Dwight Eisenhower would revoke 9835 with his executive order 10450, but this order dismantled the loyalty boards by transferring power to federal agencies. It also expanded investigations to include those engaged in immoral or disgraceful behavior. This included what is considered sexual deviance and led to the witch hunting and discrimination against gays and lesbians in civil service.
Rebuilding America. The Rick Smith Show.
When they blew the horns, and the walls came down. They'd all been won, but the walls came down. I don't think there are any Russians, and there ain't no Yanks, just corporate criminals.
So I guess at this point we're just winging it. I guess the being president is just whatever I feel like at this moment. The big story today on the phone call was not so much the fact that in big bold letters, do not congratulate was there. Everyone was taken by surprise when Trump evidently threw it out that, hey, Pootie, let's get together sometime. There had been, nothing in the briefing to say, hey, let's schedule a meeting. There had been no discussions of a possible meeting. There had been no, beginnings of having a meeting. None of that stuff. And it kind of just threw the entire system into chaos. And this is what this guy does. Now, because understand, you've got senior White House officials who have, been opposing the idea of a bilateral meeting with the Russians. And now you've got Trump going completely and totally against his people. I mean, what kind of message does that send? What message is that sending, to Putin? That you've got a boob in the White House. You've got a doofus who won't listen to his career people. I mean, you think about it. Putin's been in power for a long time. You had Bush who evidently they took a little ride in the VW together, and Bush, looked into his eyes and could see into his soul. I could see into his soul, and his soul was going, I'm gonna stick it to you guys. Someone said earlier today, I kind of missed the Cold War. I go, why? It never ended. We're the only ones who stopped fighting it. They still are. They still have the same mentality. They want to dominate. They want to get the old band back together. And yet we're the ones who let's hold hands. Scary, scary times. Anyway, billionaire Betsy testified in front of Congress on the Department of Education budget. And, a bunch of stuff in there that you go, okay, a lot of numbers, a lot of, bad priorities, more money for charter schools and private schools, less for public schools. You knew that was coming. The ideological part, that's what they want. A little tidbit did drop from the reporting. And I don't know that it came out during the hearing, but from what reports are, billionaire Betsy wants to take over the Department of Labor's job training programs and put those into the Department of Education. Oh, that's going to go well. We're going to charterize job retraining. Think about, let that sink in for a second. Let the reality of even further profitizing the demise and the misery of working people. Stop and think about that. Let that just kind of sink in. It's not bad enough that people are going to lose their jobs. It's not bad enough that with every trade deal we've put in trade adjustment assistance, knowing that we were going to lose jobs. We knew it. Now billionaire Betsy wants to take that and put it into her twisted ideas of let's profitize education. Get it out of the hands of the people and into the profit, because they know what to do with it. They do, and let's make money off of it. And I guess the thing that gets me is, there's part of me that goes, maybe someone sees Betsy DeVos as the education version of Jared Kushner, because Kushner's in charge of evidently everything, and I have no idea why. Here's somebody who has no qualifications whatsoever, has no reason whatsoever to be anywhere near classified information, let alone he shouldn't even be allowed on the tour of the White House. And retired 4-star General Barry McCaffrey, I think, said it best. He said, putting Jared Kushner, a 30-something person with no foreign policy experience or defense policy experience, as the leading representative of the United States is simply outrageous. I would, if this weren't terrestrial radio, I would use the giant F word and then the stupid word. Because it is. Putting him in charge of this stuff is stupid. McCaffrey went on to say, so reading out the State Department and having one-on-one contacts with Jared Kushner by phone and in person is a huge threat to rational policy-making process. Now, this is in response to the statement by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who evidently was bragging that he had Kushner in his pocket. And I'm sure there are a lot of those people who go, we've got him in our pocket because he owes us tons of money. And again, this is the reason you go through a vetting process. This is the reason that you fill out those forms, those long, boring forms. It's kind of the reason you do that. McCaffrey goes on to say, it has no precedent, in my view, in the American government. He said, if I were the president's lawyer, I would say, if you think they have a video on you, he'd better get it out now. McCaffrey said Putin will stick it to him prior to the next election or after he leaves office. And this is what I've been saying for a long time. Putin's not the friend. Putin's got information. And it wasn't only on Democrats. So the patriots in the Republican Party should probably step forward now and say, whatever it is that has, come forward with it. Just kind of a thought. Because remember, it's always the lie that gets you. It just is. It is what it is. And one last bit of crazy, since it seems that there never seems to be enough time in the day to talk about all of the insane things that Republicans are doing now. And I guess it's what happens when you get into power, or you're just plain freaking paranoid. Evidently, Representative Claudia Tenney, she's a Republican from New York. Evidently, she is blaming the deep state, whatever the hell the deep state is. I always thought it to be like, like the CIA and, like the deep cover operatives in the military, the people who, go around the world and they start little wars and they take out dictators. And, a couple years ago, we had a guy on the program. His name was John Perkins, wrote a great book. It was called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And he used to tell the story of, how he would go into these different dictators who had newly taken over. And he would show up with a huge, giant briefcase full of cash, millions of dollars in a giant box. And he would put the money on the table and he'd put a bullet next to it. And he'd go, well, choose one. That's what I see as the deep state. If we have, and we do, I'm sure we have one. Those are the deep state people. Those are the people who do all kinds of covert stuff around the world, that bad things happen and we have plausible deniability because they're the deep state. Evidently, Ms. Tenney thinks that the deep state is the reason that Ben Carson bought a $31,000 dining room set. Evidently, she was doing a radio program and he brought it up. The guy, brought it up. And her response was, first of all, I like Ben Carson a lot. I think he's really trying to do a great job there, but his staffers, one of his key people was in my office the other day to talk about some housing issues that we're having in our region. And we were talking about that. And he said, you know what? Somebody in the deep state. It was somebody in the deep state. It was not one of his people, apparently, who ordered the table, like a conference room table or whatever it was for the room. She went on to say, and that's what it cost. Ben Carson tried, he said, he tried hard, tried to turn it back, but, procurement happens. That's a different way of saying the S happens, just with procurement. But it was the deep state's fault. Now understand, Ben Carson himself isn't saying it was the deep state. In fact, Ben Carson himself is blaming his wife. So evidently his wife is part of the deep state. You can't make this up. Where's Michelle Bachmann? If we could throw her into the middle of this, it would be just great. She said, Ben Carson said, I invited my wife to come help. He said, I left it to my wife, to choose something. I dismissed myself from the issues. So it was Mama Carson, the deep state. I mean, you really can't make that up. And this woman is a sitting member of Congress. And, it makes me think, though, sometimes, have congressional representatives always been this flippin' nuts? Or at one point in the past, were they, saner? Did we vet them better? Were they, because there's a part of me that goes, because of all of this purity nonsense, because we care about who's doing what to who, and we've gotten into this where you have to be, squeaky clean to get elected because, we care about their personal lives, which I got to be honest, most people, I could care less what you do within the confines of your four walls with consenting adults. I want you to push policies that are going to make our lives better. I want you to push policies that are going to make my kids' lives better. They're going to invest in our infrastructure, invest in the future, and give us a future. Instead of this situation now where we got a whole bunch of people who have never had an affair, but boy, they're the biggest. Terrestrial radio again. They're the biggest no good for nuts you'll ever meet. And won't do a darn thing to help anyone else. I mean, it's really angering. And that again comes back to us. So I'm hoping 2018, I really am. I'm hoping 2018 is that time where we we start to turn things around. Just my thought. And if it means a whole bunch of women running for office, so be it. They can't screw things up any worse than men have done for the last 200 years. Just a thought. Love to hear yours. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Quick break. Right back.
I got no time for living, yes, I'm working all the time. It seems to me I could live my life a lot better than I think I am. I guess that's why they call me the working man.
Making the blue blood see red. The Rick Smith Show.
Inside the Trump administration's newly unveiled sanctions against Russia is a startling accusation.
FBI warns Russian hackers attacked the U.S. power grid and critical infrastructure systems. As storms get stronger, building codes are getting weaker. FEMA's flood maps dramatically understate flood risk for 41 million Americans. Plus, Trump's FEMA has deleted all mention of climate change from their strategic plans.
Because if you don't mention it often enough, it doesn't exist. All of those stories and more straight ahead. From BradBlog.com, I'm Brad Friedman.
And I'm Desi Doyen.
Stand by for 6 minutes of independent green news, politics, analysis, and snarky comment.
Because whether it be fossil fuels or calling the president a moron, we know Rex Tillerson likes it crude.
Well, he used to. This is your Green News Report. Okay, Desi Doyen, the good news? Winter is now officially over.
Yes, that's good.
But not the extreme winter weather. A tornado tore through Jacksonville, Alabama on Monday night, causing what is being described as significant damage. Unclear on the full amount of damage or the injury toll at this hour, but reports suggest there have been much of both. Meanwhile, as the southeast gets pummeled, the northeast is battening down its hatches yet again for its fourth nor'easter of the season. And meteorologists are predicting a fifth one for this weekend. So,
wow.
Yeah, you know, when they had two in a row, you and I both agree, back-to-back nor'easters, not that unheard of. But back-to-back, maybe we got a real problem here.
Yeah, the frequency of these storms is really what officials should be paying attention to, because it hasn't given communities much time to recover or to restore their electricity. And as if to underscore the importance of being prepared for climate impacts, a new study released on Monday from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety concludes that states are ignoring warnings from the insurance industry and federal scientists and are failing to upgrade their building codes to withstand the higher risk of extreme weather events. Bloomberg News reports that despite the increasing severity and cost of natural disasters, real estate developers are succeeding in lobbying state legislatures to relax building codes and regulations. That's with help from local officials who are seeking to increase home sales that also increase property tax revenue, even though the trend leaves residents more vulnerable to climate impacts.
Get money the hell out of politics, and so many of our problems are immediately solved.
On top of that, another new report concludes that FEMA's flood maps that identify flood-prone areas in the U.S. are actually wildly outdated and dramatically understate the actual flood risk.
Fantastic.
University of Bristol researchers working with the Environmental Protection Agency and other organizations estimate that 41 million Americans are at high risk of 100-year floods. That's 3 times more people than the current estimates. That means that many homeowners are likely underinsured against floods right now. The researchers say the process of drawing FEMA's patchwork of flood maps is extremely long and extremely complicated, and it uses past data, not forward-looking data, and it relies in part on local input that can be influenced by political considerations. For example, Florida alone has about $700 billion worth of real estate located in those 100-year floodplains. As global warming intensifies the severity of extreme weather events, President Trump's FEMA, which is responsible for dealing with the aftermath of disasters like hurricanes and floods, has removed all mention of climate change from its 4-year strategic plan. That's despite the fact that increased hurricanes, flooding, heat waves, wildfires, drought, and sea level rise are all scientifically linked to climate change. In the document, FEMA actually admits that, quote, disaster costs are expected to continue to increase due to rising natural hazard risk, but it doesn't say what might be causing those risks to rise.
Who knows?
It's a huge shift from the Obama administration FEMA, which in its long-term disaster plans repeatedly focused on the need to incorporate and prepare for increased climate risks. Finally, officials with the Department of Homeland Security and Federal Bureau of Investigation last Thursday accused Russian hackers of infiltrating crucial infrastructure systems like energy and water in both the U.S. and Europe. The report is the first time the Trump administration has officially named Russia as the source of the hack attacks and alleges that starting in 2016, hackers linked to Russian intelligence agencies targeted and in some cases successfully infiltrated computers that control U.S. nuclear power plants, electric plants, water, and aviation systems. The DHS report says that the hackers did not go so far as to sabotage or shut off any power plants, but that they could have, at will.
Things are going very, very well, aren't they?
They sure are.
For much more on all of these reports and the ones we couldn't get to today, please check out our website at greennews.bradblog.com. Find us, follow us, and share us worldwide on the Facebooks and the Twitters at Green News Report. I'm Brad Friedman.
And I'm Desi Doyen.
And this has been your Green News Report.
It's getting better all the time. It's getting better all the time.
Yes, it is all about the children, even after they're born. Rick Smith.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Check out the website, thericksmithshow.com. So we've been seeing, organizing, especially among teachers that I don't think we've seen in a very, very long time. You look back to the 1970s, and I have a friend who, she lived through those battles. And she talked about, back in the old days, because she's been retired a number of years. She said back in the old days when you were basically working for poverty wages and you were expecting little Johnny or Susie to bring in an apple so you could have lunch, everyone loved you. Everyone loved the teachers. But as soon as you said, you know what, I want to make a decent living, I'd like to make sure that maybe I can buy a pear, I can buy my own apple, that's when things maybe started to turn a little bit against them. And it all came out of the organizing of the 70s and the fights that she told so many stories about. But are we back at that moment again? Are we finally back at a moment where the attacks on teachers, the attacks on workers have gotten so bad that finally they've stepped forward? That's why I've asked Jon Shelton to come talk with us. He's an assistant professor of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. Also the author of Teachers Strike, Public Education, and the Making of a New American Political Order. Jon, thanks for taking time for us.
Hey, Rick. How you doing tonight, man?
I am good. Are you encouraged by what we're seeing in places like West Virginia and places like Oklahoma, Arizona, Kentucky? Are we encouraged by this?
Yeah, it's extremely encouraging. So in my book, as you kind of intimated, I looked at some of these big, early battles for teachers to get union rights, decent pay, and maybe even more than that, respect. Being freed from essentially a never-ending day of non-professional chores, supervising students during their lunch hour, all those things that, we think teachers should do this because they care about kids, but they're also people and they're also workers. And in a lot of ways, we're in, at least in those places that you just mentioned, we're seeing a return to those times. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that. So I cite in my book the fact that before unions in New York City, you could make more money washing cars than you could as a high school teacher there. The average wage for a car washer was higher. And I was just reading how in Oklahoma, for example, you can make more money as an assistant manager at a gas station. Now, I think people who, manage a gas station deserve to have a living wage as well. But we're kind of back to those times in some ways. And I think what's really interesting about seeing this for me is seeing these really spontaneous upswells of people saying, we're not going to take this anymore. We care about your kids. And because we care about your kids, we have to be treated as professionals. We have to be treated with people with like people with dignity. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to do a good job, which is what you want us to do.
Yeah, I've been watching all of these attacks on public teachers, public school teachers, and education as a whole for the last several years, and my simple statement on it is twofold. One, the greedy need more, so we have to feed their insatiable appetite for more by stealing from the children, and then two, it's those nasty evil teachers unions who want pensions and health care and reasonable wages that must be broken. So it seems to me that that's the push. And finally, teachers have, said enough, I think. At least it's my view. I'm curious yours.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely happening. And what's interesting about it is if you look at West Virginia and Oklahoma, one of the reasons that those places have seen teachers treated so deplorably is because the wealthy haven't been paying their fair share of taxes. Now, we know that the wealthy benefit from the education system, probably as much as anybody else, right? They need to have educated workers, working on the job site, but they're not paying their fair share of taxes, right? I mean, you probably saw that the governor of West Virginia comes from a wealthy coal family and actually owed the state back taxes. So it was a great irony.
Yeah, in Kentucky, wasn't it?
Yeah. He actually owed back taxes in a couple of states, I think.
Yeah, Kentucky being one of them.
Yeah, exactly. Kentucky and West Virginia. And in Oklahoma, I was reading actually that one of their problems is that when they had this big oil and gas boom in the early 2010s, they cut the taxes to almost an absurdly low level. And that's one of the reasons they can't afford to pay their teachers, a decent salary, and they're moving to Texas in many cases. So they've decided that they've had enough, and I think that what in some cases what these teachers are able to do is actually make this argument that this is about the wealthy staying wealthy and not wanting to support what really should be a right for everybody.
No, I'm right there with you, but you hear this frame, and I'm sure you've heard it a million times too. You don't need all that money. You don't need money. Doesn't educate children. You can't throw money at a problem, John.
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the really interesting things about the history of education in the United States. Go back to the 19th century, and I'm really fond of telling people this because I know you're a very patriotic American, Rick, and I'm a very patriotic American, and I think one of the things that we should be most proud of in this country is that we were the first country really to give all of our citizens public education, right? Starting with grammar schools and then, going up through high schools in the early 20th century and then expanding that to university system after World War II. But what's really interesting about this is that one of the ways that the United States was able to do that in the 19th century was by effectively having an enormous female workforce. So there's always been this tension of we want to have a really great education system. We want teachers to do a really good job, but they shouldn't really care about how much money they make. They should want to basically make just enough to live on maybe. The expectation in the 19th century, of course, was that teachers didn't even deserve to have a personal life. They weren't supposed to get married. And that's always been the expectation, right? Like we say we respect teachers. When you do, opinion polling, people say they're very proud of their local schools, but then often people who are in charge, they make this argument that, well, we don't have enough money to pay for that. You'll just have to get by another year on your love for kids, basically.
And also dig into your own pocket to buy paper and pencils and school supplies for the kids who can't afford it. That as well. But the thing is I love how you bring up everyone loves their local public school and love their teacher and everything. And it's kind of like the same scenario when you talk about Congress. Everybody seems to love their congressman, but hate everybody else. And I've had so many people say, well, yeah, my public school is good, but the rest of them are terrible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what's super interesting about that is that, and I talk about this in my book, as you mentioned, but one of the things the right has done, going back to the 1970s, is they've made this claim that public institutions are failing. So what's really interesting about that is that there's a real incongruity, right? People like their own schools, as you mentioned, but the right has constantly said, well, it's not your school that's failing, but the education system itself is failing. So a lot of people, I think, have this disconnect. Their school is going great, but the system as a whole is problematic. And the politicians on the right and embarrassingly, too many Democrats have made this argument that it's teacher unions that have prevented the schools from doing impossible things, right? I mean, as we've allowed economic inequality to grow as large as it has to really obscene proportions, we still have this kind of bootstrap mentality that you can just give people the right education, then they can transcend, whatever situation they grew up in.
Yeah.
Well, it's way more complicated than that, of course. But then we blame teachers when we can't overcome the poverty of their students or learning disabilities that their students might have. And it's really crucial because we talk about teacher unions, right? I remember Chris Christie back in, I believe it was the Republican National Convention in 2012, back when everybody thought Christie was like a viable presidential candidate. Those were much simpler times.
You're absolutely right. I know where you're going with this because I remember the quote
Christie,
too.
He said, yeah, exactly. He said the Democratic Party believes, he said, we believe in teachers. The Democratic Party believes in teacher unions, right? And so it was an attempt to separate, your average teacher that people like from these big bad teacher unions, this huge lobby that's supposedly, ruining the American education system. And Betsy DeVos and her crew who want to privatize education, that's a key part of, her attempt to make the argument that something has to be done about this. It's teacher unions that are in control of the public education system.
Yeah, not that crazy woman who we saw in 60 Minutes. Did you see her 60-minute interview?
I just saw clips of it. You mentioned this earlier. It's hard to keep up with all of the outrages. I mean, I feel like I'm hearing about stuff constantly that I didn't even get a chance to watch. But I saw several clips of it, and it was embarrassing.
It's embarrassing. And to be honest, she should be the poster child on why you should have public schools, because she didn't go to one.
That's right. That's right. She couldn't even talk about really rudimentary usage of evidence, right? I mean, they were asking her about whether or not school choice had improved schools in Michigan. She had no answer. She couldn't. She clearly hadn't looked at the data. And, you would think that for somebody who had spent their life supposedly pushing for education reform that was going to help out poor students, she would at least have some data from her home state that would show that the school choice program that she had been pushing for was actually improving education. Turns out it's not, but it was embarrassing. As I say in the article for American Educator, she's clearly the least qualified Secretary of Education we've ever had, and it's not even close.
Yeah, it's not even close. And if you remember, the day after the interview with 60 Minutes, she tweeted out her statement on, I sent this to 60 Minutes and they didn't use it. And there were two graphs, one on reading scores and one on math scores. And they didn't actually prove her point. In fact, they were the opposite of her point, which is if you looked at them, Michigan was doing just a little bit better than the national average until they went to these school choice programs. And now they're doing worse. And you go, no, Betsy, you sent out graphs to disprove your argument. Maybe you should think that through again.
Well, maybe it was the deep state.
That's it. It was the deep state. See, But this is how absurd this whole thing has gotten, and which is why I'm happy to see people in West Virginia and soon to be Oklahoma and maybe Kentucky and Arizona and maybe people just saying, what. The intelligent people, the people who know something, maybe we need to grab this whole thing back again.
Well, even beyond that, and I agree with that point. But one of the things I would stress about this is that, I'm sure you know this, and I'm sure most of your listeners know it too, but I'll remind you, Strike was illegal in West Virginia. The strike, if these teachers walk out in Oklahoma, it's going to be illegal.
Right.
And what we're already seeing is that, I was just checking the latest news on Oklahoma today. The legislature is trying really hard to avert a teacher strike, right? Because they know there's literally nothing that they can do to stop it. You can't arrest 10,000 teachers. You can't fire 10,000 teachers. What makes this so interesting is that teachers are important. Not that any worker isn't important, but teachers, seeing what happened in West Virginia and now seeing this potentially replicated in other places, there's a real realization of the power that people can have, especially in education, because this is such an important aspect of American life and the American economy, that if you just act in a collective manner, you can realize a lot, because even though the strike is legal, there's nothing practically you can do about it. There's too many people and they're too important to replace them. And I think it's a good lesson for all workers in this country to use the leverage that they have in order to change things. We talk a lot about, making electoral changes in this country. And I know everybody is really looking forward to the midterms and 2020 to end this really outrageous, real state of siege that we're under. It's not an understatement to say that, or an overstatement to say that. But, we can change things beyond the political process. If working people shut things down, even when it's illegal, they can prove that we're the ones, the people who educate our kids, and in my case, educate university students and the firefighters out there, the sanitation workers. We're the ones who make the society work. It's not the wealthy as much as they want us to believe they're the job creators. It's ordinary people. It's workers, and so that's where I'm most encouraged by this.
No, I say often, I'm looking forward to the working class of this country realizing that they have power, becoming much more militant, and when necessary, folding their arms and marching their feet.
That's right. And, it doesn't have to just be workers. Of course, we've got these walkouts now around the real outrageous state of gun violence in our schools. And in particular, looking at education. Education, not only does it have a serious cultural importance, right? Going back to those things that I said we should all be really proud of in the 19th century, this American innovation. But our economy is one that's now literally built around this idea of workers having, and I hate to use this term, but this is the term people use, human capital, right? That getting the skills that you need to compete in the global marketplace is how you actualize economic opportunity. And so for that reason, I think it's not a surprise that we're seeing schools as these sort of central sites where teachers and students are, as you said, realizing their power. So it's really an exciting thing to see.
No, and look, the teachers are the best place for that to happen because you're training the next generation. And that gives me hope that, it's my view that these kids are going to be the greatest generation again as that fourth turning happens. And they're the ones who are going to have to clean up all the mess. So they need to learn it.
And they need to see democracy in action. And I think seeing your teachers stand together and do something that's going to not just improve their own conditions in the classroom, but realizing that their teaching conditions are the same conditions under which you learn, and that they're doing that to help you out as much as they're helping themselves. That's how we're going to turn things around in this country, is by getting everyday Americans, as you said, the youth, to understand that that we have this tradition of democratic action, and we have to sort of constantly replenish and renew it. And that's how we're going to change things. So I couldn't be more encouraged by what's happening.
No, I'm with you. It's the last question I've got for you. As someone who you're a professor of democracy and justice studies, this has got to be, you don't even need a textbook. I mean, you're living history. You're living examples of what I think your class should be about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really privileged to work in one of the most interesting academic situations in the country, and I'm not exaggerating. I know you have my good friend Harvey K on the show all the time. But there's not another program that's like ours. We engage in this question of democracy and social justice from a variety of different angles: history, political science, sociology. And it really has been interesting to see our students galvanized by this state of events. And I'll tell you what's really cool is, this is my 5th year at UW Green Bay, and so I've now had students graduate and are going on to do exciting things. Just in the last year, I've had 2 students come out of our program and get jobs in the labor movement. One's an organizer for the National Nurses Union. The other is working as a labor educator for AFSCME in New York. So, it's incredible. I don't think that young people were as galvanized about labor and class politics even 10 years ago. And so it's a really exciting time to be teaching in my program.
As I say, every generation has to learn solidarity, and well, we're looking at it right now. Jon, I appreciate the time. Great book. I hope people will pick it up. Teacher Strike, Public Education in the Making of a New American Political Order. We'll get a link on how you can pick that up. I appreciate the time, Jon. Thanks so much.
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me, Rick. Have a good night, man.
Always good talking with you. Let's take a quick break. Right back. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk. I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1960. That was the day of the Sharpeville Massacre in South Africa. Black South Africans were required to carry identification documents. These passes limited who could live or work in designated white areas of the country. This restricted black workers from finding employment, especially in urban areas, if they did not have the required pass. Police would patrol the restricted areas looking for and arresting those without documentation. Black residents organized against this restrictive apartheid regime. At the township of Verning, a large crowd gathered, numbering in the thousands. Petrus Tom, a factory worker who had become an organizer for the Metal and Allied Workers Union, described the plans that led up to the demonstration. Inside his factories, workers would wear "Away with the Passes" stickers. They organized at bus stops, urging workers getting off the buses to burn their passes in defiance of the restrictive law. Petrus said it was the strongest campaign I'd ever seen. The organizers called for a demonstration outside the local police station. The plan was to turn themselves in for arrest for refusing to carry the pass. The police fired into the crowd of unarmed protesters, killing 69 people. 200 more were injured. Most of those shot by police were shot in the back as they were trying to flee the gunfire. Thousands of black South Africans were arrested in the days following the protest. Sharpeville became a watershed moment in the anti-apartheid struggle. In 1996, Nelson Mandela chose Sharpeville as the site to sign the country's new constitution. Today is now honored as Human Rights Day in South Africa. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show.
Remembering that united we bargain, divided we beg. Rick Smith.
To this battle, take my union gun. Gonna end this world of slavery, for this war is one you're bound to lose. Are you fascists bound to lose?
So we'll wrap today up with a little depressing news from Illinois. The conservative Democrats, they're the ones who seem to win. The centrist, middle of the road, they're pointing out Dan Lipinski. He squeaked out a victory in the 3rd congressional district there over Marie Newman, who was, backed by Planned Parenthood and a number of progressive groups. That's the sad part. We also had Renato Mariotti on the program, was hoping he would do well in the Attorney General's race. He did not. Pat Quinn, the former governor of Illinois, he moved on to the election. He'll probably be the Attorney General. In the governor's race, you had Bruce Rauner, who squeaked out a win on the Republican side, and the billionaire J.B. Pritzker won on the Democratic side. So it will be interesting to see the battle of the billionaires for governor. And this is part of my problem. I mean, I look at this stuff and I go, really? Is this the best we can do? Is politics now, is this now the polo for the wealth class? Do they have nothing better to do than take and take and take? But that's what it's going to turn out to be there. There was some other, again, the governor's race. I would have loved to have seen Daniel Biss, who we had on the program a couple of times over the last year, talking about his campaign, who actually had some pretty good credentials. But Pritzker won by over 20 points, and that's what writing a check for $70 million of your own money. That's what that does. So there you go. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the big election and where we're going forward. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. If you missed any of today's program, thericksmithshow.com is where you get the podcast, the Rick Smith Show app on the smartphone. Take the program on the go, wherever you go. Looking forward to tomorrow. Big night there as well. Love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow.
Smith Show. Together, we can make America better. Email rick@thericksmithshow.com or interact with us anytime at thericksmithshow.com. Until next time, this has been The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk.
It's color like the tide of flood beneath the lunar sway.